mother kills her offspring, she breaks a sacred bond.
I had to accept that they weren't coming back.
One mother drowned 2 young sons she thought stood in the way of her happiness.
In a dark car, they're floating and they're screaming for their mother.
A deadly delusion drove another to destroy the family she adored.
She held them down. They fought her for their lives.
And the lies of one serial killer altered medical history for years.
His paper was used for almost a quarter of a century as a license to kill.
Mothers who murdered their own flesh and blood. These were deadly women. In 1964, in upstate New York, Tim and Juanita Hoyt were newlyweds, looking forward to the birth of their first child.
Juanita said that her mother always told her that she was good for one thing, and that was to make babies, to have children.
Well, how was the day at work?
Juanita would go on to have several children, but none of them would live for long. Unnoticed in her own home, she would murder them all. Juanita Hoyt's first victim was her 3-month-old son, Eric. When she was home alone with him one day, she smothered him.
Smothering an infant is, unfortunately, a very easy thing to do, and it shows no marks.
Writers Jamie Talon and Richard Firstman have researched Juanita's story and discovered her to be a cold and distant woman.
Juanita didn't seem to grieve as you would expect a mother to grieve.
You know, when you have a baby, you take the baby in your arms, you hold the baby. She would never do that. She was very distant. If you look at pictures, she kept them, you know, at arm's distance.
At the time, Juanita's coldness went unnoticed. But 3 years later, she struck again. This time, taking 2 lives in just 2 weeks. Her 6-week-old daughter and her 2-year-old son.
I don't think you can even call her a mother. Anybody who takes their children away cannot be called a mother.
No one suspected Juanita of any crime, including her husband, Tim. Even doctors misinterpreted the deaths, suggesting they'd been caused by an illness, a frightening new disease that killed young children in their sleep, called SIDS.
SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome, and basically this is a diagnosis that is given to children under 1 year of age who die in their crib, who die while they're asleep. The only time a forensic pathologist will certify a death as due to SIDS is when they've ruled out all other possibilities.
Although they weren't deemed suspicious, the repeated deaths were unusual. And when Juanita and Tim became pregnant with their 4th child, one doctor became interested in their case and determined to stop another family tragedy if he could.
Dr. Alfred Steinschneider was sort of recreating his research world to understand why babies die inexplicably for no apparent reason. And along came Juanita Hoyt. Here he could follow the 4th baby, and maybe the key to unraveling SIDS was in his hands.
Juanita's new daughter, Molly, was closely monitored at Dr. Steinschneider's sleep clinic.
She was a happy little girl. She was just a joy to have around, you know, just a sweet little girl.
Corinne Dower was one of the nurses who looked after Molly.
Molly came in as a SIDS patient. We rocked her, we walked her, we fed her, and she was doing well.
So how's she doing today, nurse? Responding already.
The baby appeared to be fine. But the nurses did have one cause for concern. Molly's mother, Juanita, who seemed distant and uncomfortable with intimacy.
She never hugged it, never kissed it, never said, you know, anything. She just... And I thought that's a little strange.
And that's kind of what led them to suspect that there was something else going on here. They have this mother who seems to really have no connection to the baby, and then these babies are dying mysteriously.
The nurses began to suspect that this medical investigation should be a murder investigation. But the doctor disagreed.
Yes, nurse.
I'm really concerned about Anita Hoyt and her first child, Molly.
In what way?
I'm sorry.
The nurses were very vocal in expressing to Dr. Steinschneider what they felt was going on here.
Doctor, it's just too suspicious.
And several of them went to him and said flat out that she's killing her babies.
What are you basing this on? Feeling or facts? That is quite enough, nurse.
Corinne's worst fears began to unfold.
No, I'm very busy, so if you don't mind.
Because Dr. Steinschneider, he discharged her. And I said, if you send her home, that lady is going to kill her. And he said, you're just another hysterical nurse. So what can you do?
Molly was discharged from hospital and sent home to be monitored by her mother. It was now simply a matter of time.
And then about 11:15, when we were getting ready to go off duty, I said, Joyce, what do you think? Do you think she's still alive? And of course, when I came on duty the next day, she was dead.
Juanita Hoyt was a mother who in the 1960s had lost 4 children in 4 years. Her doctor blamed the mysterious deaths on a newly recognized illness, sudden infant death syndrome. But Juanita's nurses had the correct diagnosis. This mother was a killer.
The nurses suspected it, but they had no power to investigate.
Look, I've heard enough.
And people didn't want to believe that a mother would kill her own children.
When Juanita had her 5th child, Noah, SIDS researcher Dr. Alfred Steinschneider thought he was on the brink of making medical history.
He was looking for families with these multiple deaths because he wanted to bring the next child into the laboratory to see if there was any way that they could figure out why babies die of SIDS.
Dr. Steinschneider had been developing a breakthrough theory that SIDS was hereditary, and Juanita Hoyt's case seemed the perfect one to prove this hypothesis. Noah was brought to Dr. Steinschneider's clinic for observation, and as with Molly, he was later released to be monitored by his parents at home. The nurses protested, but Dr. Steinschneider was convinced his theory was correct, and he paid scant attention to the nurses' own observations.
It's happened again.
Is there something wrong, Doctor?
They wept when he died.
Noah Hoyt has died.
This one nurse said she couldn't even look at Dr. Steinschneider.
I warned you.
She said, I told you so. I told you so.
The doctor's faith in his theory had allowed another murder to occur.
You really can't distinguish between SIDS and what they call a gentle smothering. So when you don't have any really hard evidence, it's very difficult to make an accusation.
With every one of the tragic deaths, Juanita Hoyt attracted more attention. And that was exactly what she wanted. Juanita was suffering from a disturbing psychological illness, Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
And this is basically where women, it's almost always women, will cause illnesses or even deaths in their own children in order to gain sympathy and attention for themselves. Juanita Hoyt is, you can't think of a more a classic case than hers.
But back in 1971, Juanita wasn't diagnosed or investigated. Dr. Steinschneider went ahead and published the Hoyt case as proof that SIDS was a hereditary illness. His research was followed by doctors around the world, and Steinschneider became famous for his breakthrough.
Steinschneider had the chance to intercede, to save these babies, and yet what he did was take these cases, take these deaths, and turn them into a theory that was fraudulent. So he used these deaths to advance his own career, and there's really nothing more cynical than that.
For the next 22 years, SIDS research pursued an erroneous path, and child murderer Juanita Hoyt remained free. But then one day, District Attorney Bill Fitzpatrick saw Dr. Steinschneider's research paper.
Pretty obvious to me that they were talking about the murders of 5 children.
Fitzpatrick believes that Dr. Steinschneider's theory allowed Juanita and other mothers to murder with impunity.
His paper was used for almost a quarter of a century as a license to kill.
Sergeant, I brought in my photographs of my babies just to show you how beautiful they were.
At the age of 46, Juanita Hoyt was finally interviewed by the police.
I was actually watching through a glass partition, and Trooper Mulvey, in a very, very gentle voice, told her, Juanita, you know, this is not the way the kids died.
These are my babies. My babies.
In our wildest dreams, we didn't think we would get a confession. You don't have any crime scene photos. You don't have any eyewitnesses because Juanita was the only one there when the babies died.
You're telling me that this was all coincidence?
And there came a time where she, you know, put her head down for a second. I'll never forget these words. She looked up in a very sorrowful voice and said, I've asked God so many times to forgive me.
In 1995, Juanita Hoyt was convicted of 5 murders and sentenced to 75 years in prison. Dr. Steinschneider's theory was left in tatters.
SIDS does not run in families, but murder does.
SIDS researchers had to refocus, and they began to concentrate on infant sleeping positions, with amazing results.
They suggested something called the back to sleep movement. And what was found was stunning. The incidence of SIDS dropped from 5.6 per 1,000 deaths to less than 0.5 per 1,000 deaths. In other words, only 1 infant death in 2,000 births. This has been amazing.
In 1998, Juanita Hoyt died in prison of cancer. She murdered her own 5 children. She helped provide an alibi for other mothers who wanted to kill their babies. And by misleading medical researchers, she was responsible for countless deaths.
This was a woman who craved a lot of attention. A sad person who nobody really understood the complexity of her sadness until it was too late.
Some deadly women kill out of hatred. But there are others who commit murder out of what they believe is love.
There was all these crazy things going through her head, driving her to places that she didn't want to go. No one could believe that a mother would do this.
In Houston, Texas in 2001, Rusty and Andrea Yates were known by their friends as a loving, devoted couple.
I believe we got it right here.
There's no question but that there was a bond of love between the two. Andrea was extremely devoted to Rusty. Everything, at least from the outside looking in, appeared to be as normal as one family could be.
Rusty Yates, however, had extreme religious views.
This was a guy who firmly believed that women were secondary to their husbands. A woman had to submit to their husband. Their whole purpose in life was to have children. And so, I mean, that's why she had 5, 7 and under. It was whatever God blessed them with, that's what they had.
Now then, you lads, you can call me Sergeant, just like you can call Jesus.
The couple had 5 children, each named after a biblical character. Noah, age 7, John, 5, Paul, 3, Luke, 2, and Mary, 6 months.
Jesus looks at us all the time, and he knows when we're bad and he knows when we're good. And he counts.
But Andrea was paying a heavy psychological price for her repeated pregnancies.
Noah, come back, please. I told you, come back to the circle. Come back here and listen to the story.
Andrea had mental issues before she became the mother of 5 young children. Having all those children added so much stress to her life that her psychiatric illness flourished.
Former FBI profiler Candice DeLong has seen this same illness before, postpartum psychosis.
As a psychiatric nurse, I treated many women who had this disorder.
That's Satan listening to you and talking to you. Now you listen to Mom.
A woman becomes so severely depressed after the birth of a child that the depression spirals down into a psychosis. They are really out of touch with reality. These women may hear voices or become delusional.
Andrea heard voices often, and they told her that Satan was going to take her children.
She thought that she was a bad mother, and because she was a bad mother, all of her children were going to go to hell.
Author Diane Fanning believes that each new baby added to Andrea's psychosis.
Russell once found her in a bathroom holding a knife up to her throat and ready to commit suicide.
No!
So she had a serious mental health issue.
That is not the way.
She was obsessed with these dark, dark thoughts about what a horrible mother she was.
Boys.
And how the little tiny things that her children did were just dreadful, dreadful sins.
Noah!
Because that's what the voices were telling her.
Noah, quit it! That is not how Jesus
For 2 years, Andrea was in and out of psychiatric care. But against advice, she stopped having treatment.
The mental health professionals did not feel that she should be leaving. The insurance ran out, and there was no way they could pay for it without the insurance.
Her psychiatrists had warned her against having more babies. But Andrea's husband had other ideas. His fundamentalist beliefs demanded another child. It was after Andrea had her 5th baby, Mary, that she hatched a plan to protect her children and keep them safe. Satan couldn't take them to hell if she sent them to heaven first.
She loved them so much that she took their lives.
In Houston, Texas in 2001, Rusty and Andrea Yates had 5 children. The latest, their first daughter, Mary, was just 6 months old. Her birth would be the trigger for a devastating crime.
It was a fairly rapid decline in Andrea's mental health after the birth of Mary. It was obvious that she was becoming increasingly ill. And she was spiraling down into this black hole of a psychotic delusion.
Andrea truly believed to the core of her being that she was a bad mother, that the devil was going to get her children and take their souls to hell. The only way to save her children, she believed, was to kill them so their souls would go to heaven to be with Jesus and they would be saved. She believed this with every fiber of her being.
No, take that out of your brother's mouth.
On the morning of June the 20th, 2001, Andrea acted on her deadly delusion.
Sit down there. Come on, honey. Let's just leave those for kids. Huh? No, you come and take charge of your mother again. I gotta go, honey.
Rusty kissed the kids goodbye, not realizing that it was the last time he would see them alive. And he leaves for work.
Andrea Yates very carefully filled the bathtub with water.
One by one, Andrea took her children into the bathroom.
She drowned them in the tub, held them down. They fought her for their lives.
The oldest child, Noah, was the last to die.
As she drug him back to the bathroom to drown him, he kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Because, like little children often do, Noah took the guilt onto himself. Because we all, when we're little, think our parents are perfect. And whatever we do, we deserve it.
When she was finished, Andrea placed her children's dead bodies together, clasping baby Mary's hand in her brother's.
It's almost as if little brother is taking care of baby sister on the road to eternity. Andrea absolutely believed she was saving their souls. There's no question about it.
Andrea then calmly telephoned her husband, Rusty.
You need to come home.
After Andrea drowned the children, she did not try to cover up her crime. She called the police and told them to come over. She called her husband and told him to come home. Why would she do that if she believed what she had done was wrong? There's no explanation. She wouldn't.
Rusty stood by the wife who had murdered his flesh and blood.
He realizes that mental illness caused what occurred. He's never blamed her for taking the lives of their children.
Under Texan law, Andrea Yates faced death by lethal injection.
She should have been put into a hospital right away, but instead she was put on trial, threatened with a death sentence. She wasn't a heinous capital murderer. She was a sick, sick woman, and she needed help, not the spectacle of a trial.
I don't think a civilized society should ever execute the mentally ill when they are compelled to commit a crime because of their illness.
But Andrea Yates wanted to be executed.
She didn't want a trial. She didn't want me as a lawyer. She wanted to go immediately to death row because she believed in her unreal world that Satan lived within her. And by being executed, she would save the world from the devil.
Andrea Yates escaped the death penalty. Instead, in March 2002, she was sentenced to life in prison.
There is so much tragedy in the story of Andrea Yates. 5 children had their lives taken away before they really had a chance to live them. That is just so inconceivably horrible. 5 children at once. Andrea, too. She is a victim of her own mental health. She will never, ever recover from this.
South Carolina in 1994.
Somebody help me, please! Somebody!
A quiet night was shattered by a mother's frantic screams. Her 2 children had just been kidnapped.
A black man's taking my baby! A black man's taking my baby!
She stopped at a traffic light on Highway 49. She said that a man jumped in the car and told her to get out.
Get off the car! Right there! In the back seat!
He just got in the car and drove away. I try not to even think about what those kids face because it can become overwhelming.
I can't!
The children's parents, Susan and David Smith, lived in the South Carolina town of Union. But the story of the kidnapping grips the entire nation.
I'm sure how well-to-do are David and Susan Smith. Their 2 young boys are missing.
Michael Smith was 3 years old, and his brother Alex, 14 months.
To whoever has our boys, we ask you please don't hurt them. Bring them back.
Their father, David, still feels the pain of their loss.
was probably the worst gut feeling I'd ever had, and maybe still I've ever had.
Please return our children to us safe and unharmed.
I loved my children very much. And they were, all I had.
At the time of the boys' disappearance, David and Susan's marriage was in trouble.
It was a pretty rocky marriage from the beginning.
She fell for somebody that was actually her supervisor where she worked. And so things started falling apart.
Susan had fallen in love with Tom Findlay, a wealthy local businessman.
So what are we gonna do next?
Soon. I promise you.
Anytime before the weekend.
In the middle of '94, we decided to separate, and we filed for divorce.
Despite this, David and Susan presented a united front as the search for their children continued. But reporter Gary Henderson soon became suspicious of Susan's behavior.
I never saw any real tears. I heard sounds that sounded like someone trying to cry.
I don't know how else to put it. And I can't imagine life without them.
I noticed immediately she was speaking in the past tense. And that sort of sent a flag up for me. Why would you be speaking of these kids in the past tense if you really thought they were still out there alive somewhere?
Law enforcement officers also became skeptical, and Susan was given a lie detector test.
Susan continually failed one question on the polygraph. Do you know where your children are?
To me, she was failing because she was distraught. She was so upset. She had just had her kids, literally ripped from her.
But prosecutor Tommy Pope was less convinced, in part because Susan kept changing her story about the carjacking.
So when law enforcement's not getting accurate information by arguably the person that has the most vested interest in giving it to you, naturally questions arise.
Susan, now, we've been over this and over this. I'm not here to hear your story again.
The investigators turned up the heat and really leaned on Susan.
I don't know.
Any black man with two white boys in the back of his car, they would have seen him.
Because they actually knew that she was lying.
They don't believe your story. They don't believe you're describing a real person.
What they needed to do was get her to confess because they needed to find those boys.
Will you pray with me?
Sheriff Wells utilized a well-known technique in police interrogations, and that is what we call the come to Jesus talk.
Please bless her sons, Michael and Alex. Bring them safely back to you, O Lord.
He appealed to her sense of decency and fear of God to get the truth.
Amen.
9 days after the disappearance, Susan finally admitted what had really happened that night.
I killed my boys. I drove them into the lake. And I threw them in. I drove them into the lake.
In South Carolina, in 1994, Police spent 9 days searching for 2 missing boys. But the little boys hadn't been kidnapped. They'd been murdered by their own mother.
I had to accept that, we weren't going to find them. That they weren't coming back.
David Smith recalls what he felt when he learned the truth about what his wife, Susan, had done.
It was more of a shock when I found out that she had confessed to doing it. Because I had stood by her for 9 days, and I believed every story, every lie that she told, I believed her.
It was hard to look at her and believe she could have done something like that. And I think that's what everybody had a problem with.
The vast majority of mothers who kill their children do so accidentally in a fit of rage. They go to hit the child, and they hit the child too hard. That is not what was happening with Susan Smith.
Susan Smith had a violent past, which had continued to haunt her.
A lot of things happen to Susan that don't happen to other people.
Susan did have a very hard childhood coming up. Her father killed himself when she was very small. She was molested by her stepfather.
Susan could not handle rejection from a male. This is not uncommon among female sex abuse victims as adults that were abused by their fathers. They cannot stand the rejection of a man. It tears them apart.
On the day the boys disappeared, Susan had suffered exactly the kind of rejection she dreaded.
She was hoping to marry Tom Finley. Tom Finley wrote her a letter and told her that he didn't want kids. And so that was a problem for Susan because she really wanted to marry Tom Finley.
The letter was the catalyst for Susan's devastating decision.
Susan cared about herself. She was very narcissistic, with a little bit of sociopathy mixed in there, and her need for the attention of all the men that she wanted. It made for a very, very dangerous cocktail for those 2 little boys.
Shattered by Tom's letter, Susan strapped her 2 sons into the car and drove to a nearby lake.
She decided they were in the way and they were causing her pain. And so she merely was getting rid of the source of the pain.
Susan stopped at the top of that ramp, which is a pretty good fall down to the lake. She opened the door and hopped out. She took her car out of gear and let the car go.
She said that when the guy took her kids, that they were screaming, "Mommy, Mommy." I bet they were. In a dark car that's now rolled down into the lake, and they're floating and they're screaming for their mother.
Who knows how long it took the children to die? How long did they float out there before the car turned upside down and dropped into the water?
In the car, there would have been panic. They were restrained in their car seats, so they could only reach up just far enough to keep their nose above water. In all likelihood, they would have experienced panic, terror, as they could no longer get a breath.
Michael and Alex were found 9 days later, still strapped into their car seats.
When the diver found that the car's upside down, it's murky because it's been filled with water, and the lake water was dark. But he saw a small hand kind of pressed against the glass. A lot of guys I'd worked with for years, grown men who had worked hard on this case, that had struggled to try to bring those boys back home, and they were just openly weeping.
In July 1995, Susan Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of murder.
Susan's unusual in that the murder of her sons was premeditated, very cold-hearted, very cold-blooded. It had nothing to do with losing her temper. It all had to do with making her life temporarily better. And in that regard, she's a very unusual mother. Thank God.
Susan was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Her former husband, David, has to live with her crime every day.
There's no answer to give somebody on how to deal, especially with the loss of a child. You have to find it inside yourself. I forgave Susan for what she did a long time ago, because to me it was, keeping that in was letting her win, and I had to let that go to move on. I don't ultimately think that death would have been the best punishment, because this way now she has to live with, she has to wake up with every day what she did to Michael and Alex.
These deadly women suppressed their strongest instinct. Juanita Hoyt lived half her life with an awful secret. Rejected by her lover, Susan Smith responded with a terrible sacrifice. And Andrea Yates drowned 5 children she loved, believing she was saving their souls. Many mothers would die to save their children. But for these deadly women, the desire to protect was defeated by the urge to kill.